Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Everything Vaguely Paranormal. I'm Shelley Pruitt, and my partners in the paranormal, Mr. Blake Smith and Mr. Ryan Roberts. Good evening, gentlemen.
What's going on?
Good evening.
A little bit of a
Was it Dracula
issue.
this time? What the?
Yes, it's Dracula. You know what? I'm just going to surprise y'all every single time we come on. I'm going to give y'all a different accent. I only know
Good
two.
evening. The
Dracula
creatures of the
and
night.
British. That's it. That's my go-to. That's all that I got. I ain't got nothing else. I'm doing wonderful, Shelley. Thanks for asking.
So glad.
Right?
Is it out of your system now?
I think it is.
Yes.
Well,
Okay.
yes.
For now.
For now.
Okay.
For now.
Well, guys, tonight we are continuing our Ferocious Female Month. And of course, this is one of our favorite months because we get to delve into the world of the devious and sometimes deadly females. And tonight's female may or may not be America's first female serial killer.
Oh, snap.
Tonight, our topic is about Lavinia Fisher. And gentlemen, you know a little bit about this one, I'm sure.
Yeah, this actually comes from my neck of the woods, and I grew up going to the area of the country where she is from, and may have been at a couple of sites associated with Lavinia Fisher. So I know a good bit about this story, but I know you, and I know you probably found something that I don't know, and I'm excited to see what you dug up.
I found something that made my jaw drop that I did not know.
Your neck of the woods, huh, Ryan?
Mhm.
Is that when you were a youngin over yonder?
Oh yeah, young and over yonder, over there. So
God pray for us.
mhm.
No, I too know just enough of this story. She has been a fascination of mine, actually, with the haunting aspect of it.
Mhm.
So that I've looked into her for that reason. So I'm excited to see what you have dug up as well, to see if you can give me anything else that I may not have heard before.
Well, fantastic, and I hope I did. So, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you both parts of the story. I'm going to tell you the myth, and then I'm going to tell you the truth, because we pretty much most of us know the myth. So let's get words are hard. So let's get started, shall we? Now that that's
There we
out of
go.
my system. So our culture is obsessed with women who kill. Women like Elizabeth Bathory, Madame LaLaurie, and more recently, Eileen Wuornos and Lori Daybell grab headlines and haunt our nightmares. Lavinia Fisher is a woman who did both. Known today as the Charleston City Jail's Woman in White, she allegedly haunts the building and terrifies unsuspecting visitors. And now there are many legends of a woman in white from all over the world, and all are associated with some form of tragedy. And these stories are the most prominent in the United States, Ireland, and Great Britain. Lavinia's tale has evolved over time and is a great ghost story. And it is told and retold. And with each retelling, each storyteller places their own inflections and prioritizes the details that they find fascinating. So, truthfully, there is no documentation of Lavinia Fisher's early life. No birth record, no baptismal record, marriage license, or tax records. There is nothing recorded of her parentage, her early childhood, or her upbringing. It is speculated that she was born around the year 1793. However, from 1793 to 1819, almost nothing is known about her past. Like an apparition, she appears fully formed out of the ether in 1819. And tonight I'm going to tell you the story of the legend first, and then tell you the true story of Lavinia Fisher. And
That's
the legend.
Sorry, go ahead. I said that's interesting. I mean, given the time period, just genealogists is kind of coming out in me. During that time period, there was not good, like really good meticulous record keeping.
Right.
That really didn't come in until maybe the early 1800s, mid 1800s, somewhere in there, where the meticulous record keeping.
Right.
So it doesn't surprise me that there's not much that's known about her early life, but that
There's
kind of
none.
sucks.
Right. And this is the frontier at that time. Like this, like even though they're still close to the coast and haven't come very far from that area, this is still like the Wild West, like before the Wild West was.
But yeah, true. I mean, yeah.
So record keeping is not going to be a thing.
So yeah, we're only like 30 years past from independence. So, anyways, sorry, that was the genealogy.
That's okay. So our legend begins in Charleston, South Carolina. Lavinia Fisher, this is the legend now. Lavinia Fisher was orphaned, and she, at 15, turned to prostitution to survive. She learned to curry favor with men by being charming and mysterious. And she met John Fisher, and they fell in love. In 1810, she married the landowner, and the couple made their living running a hotel named the 6 Mile Wayfarer House, located, coincidentally, 6 miles outside of Charleston. Now, the couple was popular in town. Lavinia was a beautiful and charming woman, which added to her popularity in the community. Delicate and petite, Lavinia turned heads. The 6 Mile House was a place where weary travelers could water their horses and rent a room for the night. It was dangerous on the roads leading to Charleston. Highway robbery was a real threat to any traveler traveling in the daylight, and traveling at night was even more dangerous. But little did the travelers know that the 6 Mile House was far more dangerous than the road. And men began mysteriously disappearing. Travelers arriving at the house would be greeted by the enchanting Lavinia, and after booking them into their room, she would invite the weary, lone male travelers to dinner, and she would engage them in what would appear to be innocent conversation, such as, well, are you married? Or, where are you headed? Or even, what do you do for a living? She really was just trying to determine if they had money. And if they did, she would offer them a nice cup of tea with a special ingredient, oleander.
Ooh.
And once they drank the tea, she would send them off to their room. The men retired for the night, grateful for a home cooked meal and a clean bed. And as they fell into their deep and poisoned slumber, John Fisher would creep into their rooms and stab them to make sure that they were dead. Now, another version of the story says that once the men were immobilized, Lavinia would pull a lever and drop the men into a deep pit below the traveler's bed and into the basement, where rumor has it there were spikes waiting for them to be impaled on. What, Blake?
Nothing. I just it's a my generation thing that just went through my head as soon as you said she would pull the lever. I heard from Emperor's New Groove pull the lever, crop. Yeah. Anyways, sorry.
I say, but it is interesting in that version that she's almost like a pre-H.H. Holmes who had the lime pits in the basement and the chutes where they would dump the
But
bodies.
her basement was alleged to have spikes in it, so they dropped right through the bottom of the floor and into the basement where they were impaled on spikes.
It's like a fucking Mortal Kombat fight pit.
Now, in yet another and more scandalous version of the story, after the tea, Lavinia would use her feminine wiles and skills of seduction to gain an invitation into the men to join the men in their room, where she would crush their skulls between her thighs.
That's how I want to go.
God damn.
I don't know if any of y'all know how hard it is to crush a skull, but it's really hard. I don't think just the thighs were going to do it. That's just my opinion.
She might. Hey, she working the farm, man. She's doing all this squats. You never know.
But in all of these stories, Lavinia is the dominant partner and the evil mastermind of the crime, not her husband John. He is painted as merely her accomplice. And soon, reports were piling up about missing men, and they all were last seen at the 6 Mile Wayfarer House. There were claims that there were numerous bodies and skeletons buried on the property, and decaying bodies rotting in the pit. So local authorities investigated, but they found no evidence of misdeeds. So the investigation was dropped. But as more and more men went missing, the rumor mill began to do its work. The locals gathered a group of vigilantes who went to the Fishers Hotel in February of 1819 to stop any activities. And when the mob returned to Charleston, they left a lone man named David Ross to stand watch in the area. Early the next day, David Ross was attacked by 2 men who dragged him before a group of other men and a woman that he identified as Lavinia Fisher. He looked to her for help, but she choked him and smashed his head through a window. Now, miraculously, Ross somehow escaped the marauders and alerted the authorities. And at nearly the same time, John Peoples was traveling from Georgia to Charleston. Tired from his long trip, he stopped at the 6 Mile house to inquire about a room. And of course, he was warmly greeted by Lavinia, who seemed sad to inform him that there were no rooms available. Well, wanting to ease the weary traveler, she invited him to have dinner and a cup of tea with her and her husband. I mean, it was the least she could do. Now, during dinner, Lavinia's company was so pleasant that John Peoples ignored Lavinia's husband's odd glances at him. And instead, he chatted with her, answering every question and smiling at her every giggle. And when she excused herself from the table momentarily, she returned with tea and good news. A room had suddenly become, that was if John still wanted it. And John was grateful, and he quickly accepted the room. And with that, Lavinia poured him a cup of tea. Now, John Peoples didn't actually like tea, but he didn't want to seem impolite. So instead of refusing or leaving it untouched, he poured it out when she wasn't looking. And when the tea time had ended, Lavinia showed John to his room and closed the door. And as John settled in, he began to wonder why she had asked him so many questions. And why was her husband staring at him all evening? And John Peoples became paranoid. He had made a mistake by providing so much information, and he had feared that he had made himself a target for robbery. So, feeling safer in the chair by the door than in the bed, he dozed there until a loud noise startled him awake. Adjusting his eyes quickly to the dark room, he saw the bed that he should have been sleeping in had disappeared into the deep hole beneath the floor. And John, fearing for his life, jumped from the window, got on his horse, and fled. And he reported the incident to the authorities in Charleston. Now, with 2 affidavits against the Fishers, the sheriff and his posse went to the 6 Mile house. Lavinia and John were arrested along with the 2 men they had allegedly been operating with. The 6 Mile house was thoroughly searched and the grounds were dug up. The sheriff reportedly found the property filled with hidden passages and items that could be traced to dozens of missing travelers. He also found a tea laced with an herb that could put someone into a deep sleep for hours and possibly kill if the dose was high enough. So at this point, I have to pause because I have my pages out of order.
It's a live show, folks. It happens.
Like I say, live show. This is what happens.
There's no do-overs. And they found a crate that said Acme on the side because that's how they got the fucking Wile E. Coyote trap for a bed.
So, but the final bit of proof, now that I have figured out where I am in my script, but the final bit of proof came when the sheriff found a mechanism that could be triggered to open the floorboards beneath the bed and a gruesome scene in the basement. There were as many as 100 sets of remains decaying and rotting in that basement, some of them still impaled on spikes. Well, now the Fishers pled not guilty, but were ordered to stay in jail until their trial.
This was here when we got here.
When we bought the place, they told us not to go in the basement. This was already here. What are you talking about?
Yeah. In May, they were found guilty of multiple robberies and murders and sentenced to hang for their crimes. At the Constitutional Court, their execution was scheduled for February of 1820. A local minister, Reverend Richard Furman, was sent to counsel the pair if they wished. And John Fisher freely talked to the Reverend, as it is said that he begged for the priest to save his soul and his life. But the cruel Lavinia would have nothing to do with him. On the morning of February 18th, 1820, the Fishers were taken from the Charleston jail to be hanged on the gallows behind the building. John Fisher quietly prayed with the minister and asked him to read a letter. And before a crowd of 2,000 people, Reverend Furman obliged. The letter insisted that John was innocent, and he asked for mercy for those who had done him wrong in the judicial process. And then John began to verbally plead his case before the crowd and ask for their forgiveness before being hanged. But Lavinia would not go quietly. She insisted on wearing her wedding dress and refusing to walk to the gallows, so she had to be forcibly picked up and carried as she ranted and raved. The reason she wore a wedding dress was that if her husband was hanged before her, then she could not be hanged, because it was against the law for a married woman to be hung. And with the Reverend Furman in attendance, she hoped that from the gallows she could seduce some young man into marrying her and rescuing her from her fate. But her plan failed. She screamed pointedly at the Charleston socialites, for whom she blamed her conviction, and a noose was placed around her neck, and her last words, "If any of you have a message for the devil, tell me now, because I will be seeing him in a moment." And with that, she leapt from the scaffolding of the gallows, attempting to kill herself before anyone could execute her. But not quite reaching the ground, she dangled down into the crowd, and it took more than 15 minutes for her to die. She kicked and screamed the entire time before finally falling silent. Later, onlookers would say that they had never seen such a wicked stare or chilling sneer as on the face of Lavinia Fisher. And for over 200 years, Lavinia's ghost, wearing a white wedding dress, has haunted the old Charleston City Jail. Mm-hmm. She is the city's woman in white. So is that the story that you have heard?
Yeah, that's the one I grew up hearing all the time. And I mean, like that's one they told me on the ghost tour the first time I took the ghost tour down there, and then that's the one that is most popular that you find online. Yeah. Now I know you got your shovel out and you went digging deep. So
I did go digging deep.
Well, and I mean that's the story that I heard as well with the 6 Mile Wayfarer house and all that kind of stuff, and her husband being involved and the leaping from the gallows and everything. I don't know if I ever heard the hundreds of remains in the basement. I knew there were a lot. I knew that there were a lot based on the lore of the story, but I don't know if I ever heard hundreds. That's interesting because we had a couple of people. My brain went to the same place. A couple of comments went is how did people not smell the rotten bodies? If that's the case, it's like true. So
well, I mean, you got to think about this too. It's a working farm in the middle of nowhere. You have all these animals around. So, and people probably didn't smell the greatest back then because they probably bathed like God knows what once maybe every couple of months. So there's a lot of smells, and she's cooking also. So all of these smells together could be covering up the smell of that stench if that truly is what's going on.
No, sorry.
I don't know.
Number one, I grew up on a farm, and number two, I have smelled rotting flesh before, and it is 100% distinguishable. I don't care what smells are coming from the farm.
But I mean, you probably had an animal die on your farm, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, so could it have been an animal they smelled? Could they be like, oh no, it's just an animal. Like, oh, an animal died.
Well, yeah, but that didn't get rid of the. I mean, that's not going to stop people from questioning.
True.
Hey, what's that smell? Oh, it's just the pig that we slaughtered that we left out in the sun to bake. I don't know. I mean, people are going to still smell it.
Right, but they could explain it away with it being, oh, it's an animal that died.
Well, yeah.
So let me answer a few of your questions, gentlemen, by telling you the actual story of Lavinia Fisher. So now you know the lore. Now you know the myth. So let me tell you what the real story is now.
Yeah, before me and Ryan get into an argument over whether you can cover up decomposing flesh.
It could be an animal.
Oh my God. I'm not saying that. Oh, Jesus. Go on with it. Yeah. The truth. The truth will set you free. Go, Shelley.
Okay, so I'm going to go back a little bit to give you a little more information because in order to understand your story, you have to understand what was going on in the time period. Okay? So Charleston, South Carolina was founded in 1670 as Charlestown, honoring King Charles II of England. And when King Charles was restored to the throne in 1660, he granted the province of Carolina to 8 of his loyal friends, known as the Lords Proprietors. However, the original village was unsuccessful. But fortunately, another village had been established at Oyster Point and sat at the intersection of the Ashley and Cooper rivers. It was a better location, easier to defend, and gave better access to a natural harbor to accommodate trade with the West Indies. And this ended up becoming the official village of Charleston. The early settlers were mostly from England, Barbados, and Bermuda. Also among the first settlers were free people of color who were born in the West Indies. And much of Charleston's history and legend includes piracy. In 1718, Edward Teach, the
Good
infamous
old.
Beard, held
Mm-hmm.
held the town captive for almost a week. He wanted medicine, and rumor has it that he had a nasty case of the clap.
Mm-hmm. Good old Blackbeard.
That's right. South Carolina declared its independence from Britain after the delegates at the Continental Congress were elected in 1774. Now, the British attacked Charleston 3 times, hoping that loyalists would come to their aid and retake the colony for England. Charleston was recaptured by the British in the Siege of Charleston in March of 1780. But unfortunately, many revolutionaries in South Carolina were motivated by the slave trade. So anybody that has an issue with this, I'm going to just go ahead and give you some trigger warnings right here because we're going to talk a little bit about this. So we don't sanitize history. So here we go. And Charleston was the hub of the Atlantic slave trade for the American colonies. In fact, the majority of the population of Charleston were African-born slaves, both before and through the antebellum period. And they outnumbered the wealthy white population that owned them. Now, after the election of Abraham Lincoln, South Carolina voted to secede from the Union on December 20th of 1860. And the first battle of the Civil War happened on April 12th, 1861, when the Confederate Army, led by General Beauregard, opened fire on the Union-held Fort Sumter in the Charleston harbor. Now, after the Confederacy was finally defeated, Federal forces maintained a stronghold on Charleston during the Reconstruction. The African American population surged as freed slaves moved from the country to the city. But Charleston had already had a large class of free people of color before the war. Almost 4,000 free black people, many of mixed race, made up about 18% of the city's population and 8% of its total population. Now, author Bruce Orr, a retired criminal investigator and author of the book 6 Miles to Charleston, The True Story of John and Lavinia Fisher, published in 2010, explains, and I'm going to quote, "To understand what happened to John and Lavinia Fisher, you need to understand the time that they were living in." So when the couple was arrested and held at the Old City Jail in 1819, slavery was still legal, and this was before the Westward Movement and the Indian Removal Act of 1930. In 1819, Congress authorized President James Monroe to send ships to suppress the slave trade, and Congress defined the slave trade as piracy in 1820. With the white population being the minority, Charleston had seen its share of slave uprisings, and in 1740, South Carolina passed the Negro Act, making it illegal for slaves to gather in groups.
Say it again.
Say that act again. You kind of cut out.
Okay. South Carolina passed the Comprehensive Negro Act, making it illegal for slaves to gather in groups, raise food, earn money, or learn to read and write. Owners were permitted to discipline rebellious slaves, and the discipline chosen was at the discretion of the slave owner. And it could include anything from beatings to lashes to death sentences. And it was all allowed under the law. So the town of Charleston was stuck between this 80-year-old law and a progressive Congress working towards outlawing slavery. In addition, the country was going through its first financial depression, known as the Panic of 1819. Though originally caused by global financial shifts related to the Napoleonic Wars, excessive land speculation, as well as the unsecured issue of paper money, threw America into extreme financial turmoil. Banks were failing, unemployment was skyrocketing, and foreclosures on lands and homes became commonplace. And corrupt and greedy officials took advantage. Now, Bruce Orr in his book explains the landscape of the city in deep detail and how it relates to Fisher's story. The wealthy and prosperous city was now in decline, and with the economy in turmoil, criminal activity was on the rise. Highway robbery was a real threat in many areas, especially just outside large cities. The wagon trade had been a successful industry in Charleston, and in early 1819, robbery on the road to Charleston was almost a guarantee. Citizens traveling the road were arming themselves and growing more and more angry with the theft of goods. Wagons were robbed going into the city for their goods and leaving the city for the money that they made on their trades. And some travelers were lured into the inns on the outskirts of town and robbed or cheated in house gambling scams. And this is where the legend of Lavinia Fisher is actually born. Now, on February 16th, 1819, a lynch mob rode out of Charleston, ready to take the law into their own hands. They had been told of a band of thieves that was working in the Ashley Ferry area outside of Charleston and intended to capture them. They were doing this under the guise of Lynch's Law, named for a prominent Virginian, Charles Lynch, who created an informal court to punish Loyalist supporters during the Revolutionary War. But it was mob justice, plain and simple. Suspects were taken before an informal trial by members of the mob. Punishments included whippings, forced allegiance, and most importantly, property seizure. And while Lynch's Law had been legitimized in 1782 in Virginia, it was illegal in South Carolina. Now, eventually they would create laws against these mob acts. Now, obviously, the connotation of lynching would change drastically after the Civil War, when white mobs began to lynch free black citizens as local, state, and federal authorities looked the other way. And here is a side note. Incredibly, it was December 2018 before a federal anti-lynching bill passed the Senate. The bill was introduced by Senators Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, and Tim Scott, and it was called the Justice for Victims of Lynching Act and would classify lynching as a hate crime. But it did not make it through the House of Representatives. Now, Representative Bobby Rush of Illinois introduced the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act in 2019, and it passed the House, but was held up in the Senate by Senator Rand Paul, a Kentucky Republican, who was concerned that it was overly broad. But finally, in 2022, President Joe Biden signed the bill into law. It was the first anti-lynching bill in the history of America. 2022?
Wow.
Yeah.
I did not know that.
That's God
That
almighty.
is embarrassing.
Yeah.
That is embarrassing. We have such a horrid history. Anyway. Side note, I found that and I couldn't believe it, so I had to include it in the story. So, this lynch mob arrived at the 5 Mile House first. There was a small group of people there, and the mob ordered them to leave. The group was given 15 minutes to disperse, and when the group protested, the mob set the house on fire and burned it to the ground. The mob then moved on to the 6 Mile House, owned by John and Lavinia Fisher. The same order was given to leave the house immediately. And with the smoke and ash still in the air, John, fearing for Lavinia's safety, convinced the other occupants to comply. And the Fishers and their guest followed the mob's orders and left the building. Now, a man named David Ross was assigned to stay at the house and keep a watchful eye on the property. And once the lynch mob left to return to Charleston, the Fishers and company came back to the house, according to David Ross. And in Ross's statement, he says that he was attacked. In his formal statement, he said that a man named William Hayward cursed at him, collared him, and pushed him out of the door. William Hayward was the owner of the 5 Mile House that had recently been burned to the ground. Apparently, he had decided to join his neighbors in retaking their property. Ross then put in his statement that he had gotten back into the house, trying to reclaim his own belongings. But once inside, Ross claimed that Hayward snarled at him, "You damned infernal rascal, if you lay your hands on anything, I'll blow your brains out." Ross then claimed that the Fishers joined in on the attack, and he stated, "Lavinia Fisher laid violent hands upon me, choked and boxed my head through a pane of window glass."
Damn.
Get the hell out of my damn house.
Yeah.
Good Lord. She ain't playing around.
I like how Ryan's just over here giggling after some guy gets his head put through a pane of window. Ryan's like,
they told him to leave, and he didn't leave. So
Now
I will
Ross,
make you through the window.
Yeah. Now Ross somehow escaped and said that as he was running away, Hayward and John Fisher continued to beat me, and I'm quoting from his statement, beat me unmercifully with loaded whips. There were 2 other men and a woman whose names I do not know, and as I was running away, someone shot at me. And as the group chased him back to the bridge in town, John shouted, "If I ever catch you, I'll give you 100 lashes." Now, once Ross's formal statement was completed, a judge signed it, and it was entered into the record. However, there was an amendment to the statement added after the judge signed it, and it read, "The deponent doth believe that James McElroy was one of the above parties concerned." And eventually, 3 other names were added to that statement: Seth Young, Andrew Williams, and Joseph Roberts. The mysterious woman was not named. Now, 2 hours after David Ross claimed that he was attacked, a trader named John Peoples was on his way out of Charleston, and he stopped at the 6 Mile House to water his horses. He and a young boy that was with him were arguing over the water bucket when he said, and I'm quoting, "Immediately 9 or 10 persons, among them a tall and stout woman, came out of the same house. They were armed with guns, clubs, and pistols, and made a violent assault on me, beating me with sticks and threatening me with guns. The woman appeared to be the most active one, beating me and cutting me over the head and eye with a stick." That's part of his official statement.
That's interesting though that he
Yeah.
would describe her as a tall, stout woman.
Right.
Very good. You're paying attention.
Because I've always heard her to be basically small and petite.
She's very diminutive. Yes.
Right.
Now, John People said that he had managed to escape, but was chased by 2 of the men who robbed him of $35 to $40 and then rode back to the 6 Mile House. He immediately went to make the formal complaint to this David Ross had done. And in the statement, he named William Hayward, John and Lavinia Fisher, Joseph Roberts, and William Andrews. And now a new name was added, F. Davis. Neither F. Davis nor William Andrews were ever found. Now, author Bruce Orr has copies of the original documents, and it appears that much of the statement is written in different handwritings, suggesting that there were additions to the statement by other persons. And John Peoples' name was spelled differently in several places on the statement. The sheriff, Nathan Green Cleary, now had statements from 2 alleged victims. So he formed a gentleman's posse and set out for the 6 Mile House to arrest the occupants. And along with the men mentioned in the complaints and the names that had been added later, there was also a woman, Jane Howard, that was taken into custody. She was a tall and stout woman. Lavinia Fisher was small and petite. Now, while searching the property, the posse found the hide of a cow hidden in an outhouse. A Charleston citizen had reported a stolen cow, so it was assumed that it had been stolen by the homeowners. Sheriff Green and the posse burned the 6 Mile House and the surrounding buildings to the ground. Everything was destroyed, just as had been the night before at the 5 Mile House. The Fishers and their cohorts were taken to the dreaded city jail in a cramped and cold paddy wagon. The jail was built in 1802 to replace the provost dungeon. It had been built on top of a potter's field cemetery for slaves, vagrants, and derelicts.
Of course it was.
The jail was large enough to house 100 people, but often had more than 300 occupants at any given time. Prisoners were put into tiny cages, and often the men and the women were not separated. Sexual assaults were rampant, not just by the prisoners, but also by the guards, who would use them for their own pleasure and toss them back into the cages. It was a notorious place and torturous place for the criminals that were housed there. Whippings and beatings were common, And a favorite torture tool of the guards was a cat of nine tails, which was a whip
Mm-hmm.
that would have been fashioned with rocks or glass sewn into the tails to inflict the most pain and damage. But torture and executions were not the most common cause of death in the jail. It had no running water, and the prisoners were thrown wood chips on the floor to relieve themselves on. The building was infested with rats and other vermin, and any open wounds from a beating would quickly become infected. There were only walls, so the prisoners were constantly exposed to the elements. And it also served as an insane asylum where the mentally ill were locked in cages along with the criminals. But the most common cause of death in the jail was suicide. Prisoners opted to take their own lives to escape the hell that was the old city jail. And this is where Lavinia and John Fisher were brought. Now, at their arraignment, the Fishers pled not guilty, but were ordered to be held in the jail until their trial that would take place in May. Their co-conspirators were granted bail. Now, a week after the arrest, the Charleston Courier printed a story dated February 26, 1819, that reported that two bodies had been found on the property. One was a skeletal burial. One was a skeleton buried on the property in an unmarked grave, and it appeared to be the body of a young slave woman. Sadly, this would not have been unusual. Slaves were rarely given a proper burial or funerals. And the other grave was a bit more suspicious. It was more recent. It was a man that had been shot about 10 days prior. And most likely, it was either the missing F. Davis or William Andrews, likely shot at the 5 Mile House and buried on the 6 Mile House property. The attack on the 5 Mile House had occurred 8 days prior, and the lynch mob most likely killed one of the occupants in the fight. And even though the mob was acting in a law enforcement capacity, killing someone would have led to an open investigation of the mob itself. As long as the lynch mob brought suspected robbers to the sheriff, they would have, in theory, done nothing wrong. Now, by the time of their trial, only the Fishers and William Hayward still stood accused. The charges were dropped on all but one man, Joseph Roberts. And when I say the charges were dropped on the others, I mean that the other names written in the formal complaints had simply been scratched out.
It's almost like somebody was like, "Oh, never mind."
Yeah.
Or maybe
the Fisher.
So maybe some money exchanged hands and
exactly.
The Fishers and Hayward were indicted for the assault and attempted murder of David Ross. And when the trial finally came, Hayward jumped bail. So it was just John and Lavinia facing a jury of their peers. And the jury found them guilty of crimes against David Ross. But the judge did allow them to appeal their verdict to the Constitutional Court and were given a reprieve until the January session of that court. So it was back to the old city jail. Now, by January, John and Lavinia had been held in the jail for almost a year. They were moved to the floor where the debtors were held. It was a less secure part of the jail on an upper floor, and they were put into a larger cell where they had a bit more room to move. Now, the Fishers knew that they were most likely going to die at the end of a rope. And desperate to escape, they devised a plan. In the dark of night, September 13th, 1819, John Fisher and Joseph Roberts, who was still awaiting his own assault trial, made a rope out of thin blankets that they had tied together. They lowered the rope carefully, and Joseph Roberts went first. John Fisher followed, but on his way down the rope broke and John tumbled about 20 feet to the ground. He was unharmed, but now, with a broken rope, he couldn't save Lavinia. Not knowing what else to do, the two men ran off into the night, leaving Lavinia behind.
Oh, shit.
Now, the city of Charleston went on high alert and began searching for the men. A $500 reward was offered for the capture of John Fisher. There was no mention of a reward for Joseph Roberts. A local grocer saw the suspicious pair and reported it to the sheriff. and the men were recaptured just 3 nights later. They might have escaped had it not been for John Fisher. He refused to leave the area because he would not abandon Lavinia. Now, on January 17th, 1820, the couple appeared before the Constitutional Court, and they were convicted of highway robbery and sentenced to hang. Now, it's worth noting, the crime they were appealing was the conviction for the assault and attempted murder of David Ross. They had never been put on trial for the charge of highway robbery. This new charge was for the robbery of John Peoples, the second man that had filed a complaint naming the Fishers. They were sentenced to death for a crime that they had never been formally charged with. So the Fishers had been officially railroaded by the Charleston courts and the state of Carolina. Now, they were given a brief reprieve because their hanging date fell during race week, and the city didn't want the publicity of a hanging of a married couple to overshadow the most important sporting and social event in Charleston.
Oh, yes. We can't have that interrupted at all by any means. Stay off there. Yeah.
We have horses to run, my darlings.
We have horses to run. People's money, gambling is on the line. We can't hang people right now. People
so a new date.
Winnings.
Yeah, so a new date was set. February 18th, 1820. Exactly 1 year from the date of their arrests. Lavinia, she was ministered to in prison by a kind pastor, but she refused grace. She insisted that she was innocent and was sure that she would be granted a pardon by the governor. John Fisher, however, found comfort in prayer. He had seemingly accepted his fate and wanted to get right with his Creator. But Lavinia was having none of it, and she had her supporters. There was a group of Charleston women petitioning the governor to release Lavinia on the grounds that she was a white woman. And the group felt that hanging was only appropriate for slaves and women of color,
Jesus.
and hanging a white woman would set a very dangerous precedent.
Wow.
Wow, that's a group of winners for you right there.
But you see, there's something that these women didn't know, but the city officials and the sheriff of Charleston knew it. Lavinia Fisher was a former slave.
Wait.
Wait, what?
I don't think I have ever heard this.
I haven't either.
Lavinia Fisher.
I'm
going to tell you.
Okay, all right.
Lavinia Fisher was a former slave.
Okay.
Author Bruce Orr, in researching his book, found her original bill of sale. Lavinia Fisher was a mixed-race slave with light skin and dark hair.
Mm-hmm.
She was described as very beautiful with an Amazon or turmeric complexion. And Lavinia Fisher was born a Fisher, not married to one. John and Lavinia were in a common law marriage and able to pass because they had the same last name. Lavinia, as a slave, had belonged to John's uncle, Colonel George Fisher, who lived in Rowan. And all slaves were given the last name of their owners at birth. She was born Lavinia Fisher. The bill of sale indicates that Lavinia and another slave girl named Sally were sold by Colonel George Fisher to Dr. Joseph Glover of Charleston for $700. It is speculated that young John Fisher had fallen in love with the mixed-race slave girl that his uncle owned. And in an attempt to separate them, Colonel Fisher sold Lavinia to a man in Charleston. But undeterred, John followed her there, and the couple ran away together. And historians agree with the relatively recently found documentation. This would explain why there is no birth record, no tax record, no census count, or marriage license for Lavinia Fisher, because reports were not kept.
Exactly.
On slaves. It was a bill of sale.
Wow.
This would also explain, mic drop, bitches, mic drop. Now, this would also explain why the couple lived 6 miles outside of town. They had to live outside of society. Lavinia was a runaway slave, and John would have been guilty of harboring a slave, and both would have been punished had the secret been revealed. But you see, there were even more reasons for the Fishers to be run off their land. Nathaniel Hayward, William Hayward's father, had legitimately left him the land. But William Hayward was in debt. 18 people, including James Fisher, John's father, petitioned the court for debts owed by William. And after Nathaniel Hayward died, William turned over the land where the 6 Mile house stood to James Fisher as repayment. Now, this explains the closeness of William Hayward and John Fisher, who were most likely friends rather than a part of a marauding group of criminals. So, why were the Fishers and the Haywards' crimes changed from assault to highway robbery? In cases of highway robbery, land and property was seized by the state, but it must sit unclaimed for 1 year before the state could claim it. And since highway robbery was a hangable offense and assault was not, if they eliminated the landowners, the state was free to claim the land. And most likely, the race was an excuse to move the execution date so that it would have sat officially unclaimed for 1 year by the law. Now, Joseph Roberts, who had escaped with John Fisher, pled guilty to assault, but he was not put to death. He was not a landowner. So on February 18th, 1820, John and Lavinia Fisher, wearing white robes over their clothing, stepped onto the gallows to be put to death for the crime of highway robbery, a crime for which they had never been put on trial. Hayward was later captured and convicted and hanged for highway robbery as well in 1820. And for the record, no one was ever charged for the murders of the slave girl in the basement or the mystery man in the fresh grave on the property of the 6 Mile house. Hayward and the Fishers were charged with crimes against David Ross and highway robbery. In addition, there were no rotting bodies found in the Fishers' basement. The tall tale of skeletons and corpses rotting in the basement came from a book written about 10 years after the hangings by Scotsman Peter Nielsen. He wrote, and I'm quoting, "In digging around in this den of iniquity, a large number of skeletons were found, no doubt the remains of an unfortunate." And he wrote this book at the height of popularity for penny dreadfuls, and the story of John and Lavinia Fisher sold well. As for the other part of the legend of Lavinia Fisher, the part that says that she was hung in her wedding dress, this would have been impossible. Even if she had a dress, all of her belongings were destroyed when the 6 Mile house was burned by the lynch mob on the night she was arrested. The wedding dress myth could have been perpetuated by the wearing of the white robes when she was hanged, which is true and verified by witnesses. Also, it was John and not Lavinia who struggled for more than 18 minutes, strangling on the hangman's noose. The executioner had tied the knot correctly on Lavinia's rope, and her neck had snapped instantly. But Lavinia's last words, they are most certainly burned into the pages of history. Witnessed by scores of people that came out to watch the spectacle of the hanging of a married couple, John Fisher had accepted his fate, and he and the pastor beseeched Lavinia to repent. And as the noose was placed around Lavinia's neck, the pastor spoke quietly to her, urging her to beg for forgiveness. And she suddenly shouted, "Cease! I'll have none of it. Save your words for others who want them. But if you have a message you want to send to hell, give it to me. I'll carry it." She held out hope until the very last moment that she would be pardoned. Lavinia Fisher's beauty, sensuality, and implied evilness adds to the mystique of her story. But there is little truth to the legend, no matter how fascinating it is. The truth is, Lavinia Fisher was not a serial killer, nor was her husband John. She was an innocent woman, She was a woman that was courageous enough to risk her life for freedom as a runaway slave. She dared to love a man that society said she couldn't have, and that it was against the law to do so in her time. She was a beauty that blended into the shadows of the city of Charleston, just 6 miles out. Is it any wonder that she died cursing for a crime that she didn't commit? She was the creation of penny dreadful novels and journalistic sensationalism. The emphasis was on profit and not on the person. So why does the story endure? Perhaps it's the dichotomy of the feminine ideal splashed against a blood-soaked canvas that creates an intrigue that tangles our minds. The nurturing, compassionate, gentler, and weaker sex that's easily moved to tears and begs for mercy in moments of brutality. Imagine as cold-hearted, vicious, violent, and unfeeling. And even more difficult to accept is that a woman would willingly commit the ultimate act of murder. We bring forth life into the world, a daunting and difficult task, bathed in blood and pain and tears. So how could we, with the extinguishment of a life by our hand, do it so easily and calloused? Now the public rationalizes that they must have been crazy, mentally unstable, or under the influence of a diabolical man, because no woman should ever be able to be capable of such destruction. But history tells us that they are, just not in the case of Lavinia Fisher. So while Lavinia is claimed to be the first female serial killer in the United States, it is just simply not true. That distinction most likely belongs to a woman named Jane Topman, who confessed to 31 murders. But that's a story for another day. And whether you believe in ghosts and hauntings, many believe that Lavinia Fisher is caught between two worlds because she refused to repent to God, therefore eternally trapping her spirit on earth. And for over 200 years, she has been labeled a murderous, a killer. So is it difficult to believe that her spirit seeks vengeance at the old city jail in Charleston for the great injustice done to her in life and in legend? So sleep well, gentlemen, and don't drink the tea.
Man,
did I tell you something you didn't know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I never ever heard that.
That is one part of it. How recent is that documentation?
The book was published in 2010. Bruce Orr found it, and I believe that I have a picture. I sent you a picture of just his book. It's in Bruce Orr's book, 6 Miles to Charleston, the true story of John and Lavinia Fisher. He uncovered the bill of sale, and it was done in 2010. The book was published, and it's been run through numerous historians, and they agree that this is the most likely record why Lavinia Fisher just suddenly appears out of nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you think about it, at that time, that's why I was so interested. I wanted to make sure I told you what was going on at the time. White citizens were documented.
Right.
They were documented. They didn't just appear. Even the most wretched white citizen had a birth date or a death date or a marriage license or a tax record.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
She didn't have any of it.
No.
And she had nothing.
And that's exactly the reason why.
That's why.
Honestly, like, that's the thing. You can go back so far as looking on genealogical records, and when you get to a certain time period, obviously it has everybody in the house, and then down below on certain lines,
it'll have like
it
3
just has
female
numbers.
Yeah,
it just has numbers. There's columns for like 3 females, 3 males, 3, I think, male child, 3 girl child, or something like that.
Yeah.
And they're just numbers.
They're listed like cattle are listed, which is horrible.
Yeah.
So,
absolutely.
I am very disappointed that it took the United States until 2022 to make lynching.
Now, on that
shocked me.
That I will say that I actually did know that.
You did know that?
I did know that portion of it. Yeah.
I did not know that. And so I was floored when I found that. But
God knows. Just to think it took that long for that to be on the books is insane to think about.
Yeah.
but and our history is marred with all kinds of stuff like that, and I'm glad finally something is on the books that prevents that from happening. But
Yeah.
what I was gonna say is I've been to that jail in Charleston, and the amount of people that they stuck, that jail is not big at all. It is tiny, and the amount of people that they stuck in that jail, and the amount of disease that ran through that place, that like we talk
That's
about
got to
going.
be about the size of Lavaca County.
It did have 4 floors. It was a
It does,
4-story building.
And there is a full basement because there was a school that was
Okay.
running like a art program in the basement. So school would rent it out for stuff. But
okay.
Yeah, which is weird because when I went to tour it and we went in there, I'm gonna tell you that place is heavy.
Well,
you
yeah,
can feel it when you walk in that
jail.
place. It's like almost electric. You can feel it.
It's a jail.
And I had my ex at the time, who didn't believe in any of this stuff, had a full emotional breakdown, was taken over by the emotion in that place. Like she freaked out. Anyway, in the basement, there was a school, an art school, and these kids were in the basement working on art projects. And I was like, so do y'all ever have any weird things happen? And they were like, yeah, we just kind of try to ignore it while we're working on our art projects. But I don't know if they do that anymore, but that place is really tiny. Like, until you go there, you don't really understand how tiny that place is.
Yeah.
And I can't believe that, they had that many people in there and were doing what they were doing to those people in that place.
And I left out
a
lot of the torture descriptions as to, I figured the cat of 9 tails with the glass and the rocks in them, I figured that was bad enough. There were all kinds, and there were all kinds of things I found, listed as some of the things that these jailers did to the prisoners. And some of them just simply couldn't pay their bills that were in there.
Right. There were debtors in there.
And they were treated no differently than the rapists, the murderers, the robbers, and
Here's what's even crazier. When I went to the jail and they were giving us the tour, they even told us that people who had witnessed a crime would be locked up in that jail, so they would have to appear in court as well. So if somebody got murdered, no, they didn't. You didn't see it.
What I found the most fascinating and what rang the most true for me is that it was a land grab.
Exactly.
And that rang very true to me. Because the governor of Carolina at the time wanted a naval base to be built.
Yep.
In the city of Charleston, and they needed enough land so that whenever the President Monroe came to tour it, that they could say, look, you have all this room. Part of that property where the Fishers' 6-mile house and Hayward's 5-mile house sat is currently under a naval air base today. So it was a land grab. And while Lavinia Fisher was pale enough for people not to realize that she was of mixed race, which is probably what saved her life when she escaped from Rowan. I believe she escaped from Rowan, North Carolina. North Carolina? Is Rowan in North Carolina, Ryan?
There's Rowan County. I don't know if
I believe so.
So, and that's on the other side of Charlotte, like up in central North Carolina.
Well, don't quote me on that. Okay, don't quote me on that. Here's the thing. She wasn't from the Charleston area. So
now I have to wonder, though, if they somehow did find out during the course that she was not actually a white woman. And that's why they, it probably contributed to what happened to her. I wonder if they ever figured that out, because I know she was passing, but
I mean, I think at some point, like
it's
something
stated
would have
that
come
the city officials knew the secret.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like it would have come up at some point if you have her in custody and her name's being ran into the paper.
Right.
She is not able to be in hiding anymore, and therefore somebody's going to come forward and go, "Here's what you need to know about her." And I guarantee you, her secret's going to come out. And I mean, come on, they moved her date and left her to hang.
Right.
I mean, that just kind of points to evidence of they knew.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. Her secret would have been found out because John's uncle was her original slave owner. And whenever John Fisher is arrested for assault and attempted murder, you don't think that's going to get back to his uncle? Because his dad's going to tell his brother that this is going on. And suddenly the name Lavinia Fisher appears.
Yeah.
So I wonder too if that contributed to the burning of the home as well when they arrested them initially, because instead of just arresting them, they burned the damn place to the ground.
But they burned down the 5 Mile house too.
That's right.
The 5 Mile house was burned down.
I think the burning. I think the burning of the house. Group. Yeah, the burning of the house and the moving of the court date was definitely your land grab. That was your land grab.
Yeah.
I think that once they figured things out,
that was kind of the cherry on top of everything.
There was no escape once. I think once they realized that they also had a, escaped slave and someone that was harboring them. I don't think that there was any escape after that. I don't think there was any way that they could let them go.
I don't think they ever intended to.
I mean, there was. They could have just been like, "Hey, it's A-okay. Go live your life." But they were assholes back then. But anyways, I digress on that.
So, I told you something you didn't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, you did. I
absolutely.
I have everything I've heard about Lavinia. America's first female serial killer. She killed dozens and dozens of men. That she was this kind of vile woman who used poison as a means to kill weary travelers that just needed a place to stay. So yeah, you told me something that, I mean, I knew that a lot of that was lore. I don't want you thinking that I was sitting here thinking she was like this gruesome woman, but I knew a lot of it was lore.
Right.
What I didn't know was what you I had no idea about being a runaway slave, and that the bill of sale being uncovered recently, which would explain, because I've always wondered why there wasn't anything,
no record
that you can find anything on her. I love my females of high notoriety, so I've looked into her from just because of the haunting, the jail haunting and all that kind of stuff, and I had never been able to find anything, and that makes so much sense as to why. Back in my genealogist brain again, it makes so much sense as to why.
Exactly.
And it is funny too, if you look at a lot of American history and a lot of the folklore from different places, we never let the truth get in the way of a good story. There's always, like even when I was researching Belle Starr and did her last week, like because of the dime store novel and the Penny Dreadful, those stories are so sensational and so much more fun than sometimes the real stories. So they get legs, and they start being the ones that people pick up and pass down from generation to generation. So it's always interesting to see where the real story and the embellished story lie in congruency with each other. But man, I mean, you just blew my mind, Shelley, with that, because I grew up with that legend. I grew up going to Charleston, hearing that legend, and I never even knew. So it's really cool.
I'm glad that go ahead. Give your final thought.
Yeah, that's what I'll have to completely change my outlook on this Lavinia Fisher. I was under the assumption that she may have done something wrong, but I didn't think that she was this. I didn't think she was America's first female serial killer. Now I'm gonna, stuck my foot in my mouth a little bit, so I'm gonna retract my statement and say that I think she was a woman who was set up, in my opinion, and I think that it was all for the fucking times that they were and the laws that they fucking had, which were gruesome and gross in of themselves and bullshit in of themselves. And I think ultimately it was a land grab, and that because of the time period and the Penny Dreadfuls, this just blew into something. Because that's the thing, they're gonna have to make her out to be something that she wasn't. They need to, because otherwise they just killed a woman for no reason.
And so they can't look like jerks.
Yeah, let's make her into something. Let's make her into something that, is just way bigger than any of it.
Brian, final thoughts?
Yeah, you have these stories that you see throughout history, and they are really good stories. So, and the victors write the history. So if you hear these stories, don't always assume that they're true. Just do a little bit of digging and see what you can find underneath the surface, because chances are you may find a mic drop moment like Shelley did.
Well, and my final thought, gentlemen, is that I have a lot of respect for Lavinia Fisher. Her courageousness, her absolute determination to live a life that she wanted. She was willing to risk her life for her freedom.
And
to be accused of a crime that she didn't actually commit when there was one so readily, the fact that she was an escaped slave, that she could have been put to death for, but they chose to give her a crime that she didn't actually commit. I can see how she would be angry about that, and how she would be, have venom for these people. But in order for her to be able to be hanged, the public had to have no sympathy for her. And with them creating this legend and lore of her, they're making it seem like she deserved it. Well, I'm telling you, I hope she did take a message to the devil, and I hope she told him that the son of a bitches who did it are right over there. And with that, Blake, why don't you? Oh, go ahead.
No, I know we're on final thoughts, but I had something in my head and it totally went out of the box. Anyways, if I think of it, I'll put it on post-broadcast.
All righty. Well, with that, Blake, why don't you tell them everything they need to know?
All right, sounds good. A couple announcements here, same as usual. Well, if y'all want to support the show directly, you make sure you go out and check out our Patreon page. It is going to be linked in our link tree, which would be on our Facebook and our X profiles tomorrow, which is Wednesday morning. For just $5 a month, you can join our Patreon, and you'll unlock over 450 Patreon exclusive videos, including the pre and the post-broadcast shows, which are the 30 minutes before and the 30 minutes after this live broadcast. Yes, we do 30 minutes prior and 30 minutes after, so you get an additional hour of this debauchery every week.
Ain't you lucky?
And also, we do offer that risk-free 7-day free trial. There we go. Sorry, too many words in my mouth. So you can check it out before you join our Patreon. So make sure you stay connected with us. Follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and many more by searching Everything Vaguely Paranormal and looking for the green sound wave, or by clicking the icons in our link tree link. And remember, to you audio listeners, you can catch us, and everybody can catch us live every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Central Standard Time on Facebook and YouTube, so you can see these gorgeous faces. If you want to see these gorgeous faces in person, you can meet us at a couple of locations. You do have quite a few options. May 30th through June the 1st, we'll be in the DFW area for Fan Expo at the K. Bailey Hutchinson Convention Center, along with Chad Wandell from Ghost Geeks. Then we are off to the Chicagoland at the Countryside Banquet Conference Center in LaGrange, Illinois on June the 7th. Then July 18th through the 19th, we are headed up to Broadhead Manor in Broadhead, Wisconsin for the Paranormal Rockdown. And then we are swinging on over to the Gettysburg Battlefield Bash from July 25th to the 27th in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. And then we are off to the center of the country for KC Paracon on August 2nd in Kansas City. And then all the way out west, September the 3rd through the 6th, we will be in Vernal, Utah for Phenomicon 2025. And finally, we are back up north where we will be attending the Rock Island Roadhouse Esoteric Expo on October the 4th in Rock Island, Illinois. So those are all your places so far that we have on the calendar and confirmed. We may have a couple more. Make sure you subscribe to our Eventbrite page to be notified when our public investigation tickets go on sale. I know we've been asked a lot if we were going to have more investigations going on sale. Yes, we will. Be patient with us. We are trying to get those on the calendar. As you've just heard, we have a lot of appearances we've got to make this year. So we are making those a priority, but we appreciate your patience with that. So we do have a couple of tickets still left available for our Gregg County Historical Museum on June the 14th, which is my birthday celebration and birthday investigation weekend. So go purchase those tickets up and come and celebrate with us. We are grateful for your continued support. Every like, comment, share, and download keeps the adventures alive. So if you have a favorite episode, share it with your friends. Make sure you tag us. And if you have a story, a comment, or a question, or you would like to have us as guest on your show, you can email all of that over to the evppod@gmail.com. That is THEEVPPOD@gmail.com.
Go like, share, and subscribe to that YouTube channel. So we want to thank you guys for joining us tonight on Everything Vaguely Paranormal. I'm Shelley Pruitt. My partners in the paranormal, Mr. Blake Smith and Mr. Ryan Roberts. Thank you for being here. And as always, we will see you next Tuesday. Bye-bye.
Bye, y'all.